Next.js announced server actions at the beginning of this month. People went crazy on Twitter. Some people claimed that writing server actions feels like writing PHP. While that may sound true, server actions does a lot of things better than PHP. In this video, I'm going to try and cover the use cases of server actions using a simple application, compare it with PHP applications side by side, and see how it feels. Before we dive into the code, let's first try and understand what server actions are. Turning to the documentation, server actions enable server-side data mutations, reduce client-side JavaScript, and progressively enhanced forms. What does it actually mean? Imagine you have a user form that upon submission saves the user data into the database. Now, in a traditional application, you would have a server API that is responsible for storing the data, and you would make your client call that API using a fetch or any other API access mechanism. Now, with server actions, you eliminate all this code in your client, move this logic to the server, and mark it as a server operation by the special syntax called useServer. Now, this doesn't mean that there won't be any HTTP request going to the server. Next will handle that logic for you by abstracting away all the client-side code and moving some pieces of it to the server. So for this comparison video, I'm going to be building a small application that has a simple user form, both in Next and PHP, which upon submission goes to a user page where you can delete a user, delete the age of a user, and add some topics. So with these examples, I hope to cover the various ways with which you can write server actions in Next.js especially, and see how it can be performed in PHP. So the first thing that I'm going to build is a user form in a Next app that is going to use a server action that is completely run on the server. So it is going to essentially create a server action inside a server component. So I'm in my Next app now in my VS Code. I'm going to create a component called create user. It's going to be a server component. And it's going to return a form with an action called save user. So this is going to be our first server action that we are going to build inside a server component. So the form has three fields: name, email, age, and a create user submit button. Let's define our server action. It's going to be an async function that takes a parameter which is of form data type. Now I can use the data to get the form data of my form. The first thing I want to grab is the name. Next, I'm going to grab the age. Grab the email. For this purpose of this tutorial, I'm going to be using MySQL database. I already have a table created in MySQL, which is of this schema type here. It has a name, email, age, and topics. And I already have the connections created in db.ts. It also exports a query function, which takes a query as a string. First query that I'm going to do is, this is a server action, so I need to define the server action here by using useServer. So the first query is going to be my insert query that inserts the user data into the database. So the result is going to have an insert ID returned by the query function. Which I'm going to use to redirect the user to the user page. So to do that, I'm going to bring in redirect from next navigation and direct the user to users/ID. So I have a problem now. It says server actions require experimental server actions option. So server actions is still in experimental mode and it's not stable for production. So if you want to use that, you need to add experimental server actions boolean inside your next config. I'm going to recompile my app and hope it runs now. There you go. The app is running. Let's check if this works. It's going to be text user. There you go. So the data was inserted into the DB and the redirection was also successful. But since we don't have the users page defined yet, next is throwing a 404. Let's go ahead and define a sample placeholder user page. I'm going to create a new folder called users. And inside that, another folder called ID and a page.tsx. So this is going to export a default function called user page, and it's going to take a params as props, which has ID string. Let's just return a sample placeholder here just to see if this is working. So I'm just going to return hello user and the ID of the user. There you go. This worked. So the ID is exactly the same ID as you see in the address bar. And now our route is also defined. So you already saw there was no message between the transition and the user does not have a feedback. In order to do that, I'm going to use a hook called useFormStatus. Now to do that, I'm going to have to abstract away some code into a client component. Let's do that. So to be able to use useFormStatus, I'm going to bring in all these fields here to a new client component. I'm going to call it fields. So this is going to be a client component. And it's going to return a fragment with all the fields. So now here I can use the useFormStatus, which is an experimental hook from React DOM. This is going to give me back a flag called pending, which I can use to give the user a feedback while the form is being submitting. I can say creating user. And if it's not pending, then I can say create user again. Let's render this component in my main create user component. Let's see if this works. So I'll create another user here next to user 3 or whatever that is, doesn't matter. There you go. We got a create user, a creating user message, and then after the user was successfully saved, the pending status changed to false. So this is a kind of a next magic that is happening behind the scenes. The useFormStatus has some way of binding to the form action that we just passed as an action prop to the form. Now let's head over to the PHP app and try to see if we can get the same experience and also the same field. So I'm in my PHP app in my VS Code. I do have an index.php and a user.php. So I'm going to be pasting some PHP code here to make the form submission possible in PHP. So this is a classical way of making a post request in PHP. First, I need to check if the request method is post, and I can grab the details from the form. This is the piece where my connection to my MySQL database is happening, and the query is inserted here. Once the query insertion is successful, I'm hitting the user, redirecting the user back to the user page. So let's see if this works. So I'm just gonna say PHP user. Okay, email address here. There you go. That was fast. Let's inspect the network and see what both the apps are doing. So I'm going to my next tab here, opening my network tab here, next user 1. Let's refresh the network tab here. There you go. So next actually made an asynchronous request of method post with the payload that we entered, and the request type is application type. Request is multi-part form data. Yeah, and type is multi-part form data. And let's see what the PHP app does. So this is doing a full page reload before doing the redirect. So it goes to the server, checks the request parameters, inserts the data into the database, and then does a redirect. Let's explore some more possibilities in Next.js by creating a server action to delete the user and delete a specific field from the table and adding some topics to the user. So the first thing I want to do on the user page is to create a delete user operation. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm gonna create a get user function here. I have the contents of it. So I'm just gonna use that. So this is going to get the user from the database. And if the user isn't present in the database, I'm gonna redirect back to 404. So let's use the function here. So needs an ID. So let's see if this works. Hey, look at that, it worked. So let's go ahead and build our delete user functionality. So I'm going to create a new component called delete user. Now this is going to be a client component. So I'm going to be showing how you can use server actions inside your client component. So let's export a default function quickly here. And this is going to return a markup. I'm going to copy paste again some contents here. I'm going to be using React's transition API here to use this delete user server action. So in order to do that, I'm going to bring in useTransition from React. It's going to have an appending flag returned and a start transition function. There you go. Now I want to create this delete user server action. So now I'm going to create it in a new file. So I'm going to create a new file called new action.ts. This whole file is going to be a server file. So I'm going to mark the whole module as a server module. I'm going to return delete. So this again is going to be an async function. Redirect is from next navigation. So now I can import here. So what this is going to do is it is going to start a transition once I click the button. That transition is taking a callback, which is going to perform this asynchronous operation. And that operation is tied to the isPending flag here. Now, as soon as I start the operation, isPending will become true and we'll get a message there saying deleting user. Once the operation is complete, it's going to say delete user. I'm going to have to send in some prop here. So it's going to be ID. Now I'd like to render this in my page component. Let's import that and pass in the ID of the user. So we have the delete user button now. Let's check if it's working. Deleting user, and there you go. So just like how the creating user created an asynchronous request, delete user is also doing the same thing by passing in the payload. And once the delete was successful, the user got redirected back to the home page. So this is one way of doing server actions where you can create a server action in a separate module and pass it down to your client component, and using the start transition API, useTransition API from React, and binding that to a meaningful feedback to the user. Let's try to build the same thing in PHP and see how it feels there. I'm going to replace the content that I had before, paste it with some new contents here. So this is going to replicate the same thing that we had in next tab. Let's check that. So I don't know a clean way to actually use the params for the PHP application. So I'm going to use a query parameter to get the ID. I'm going to display the user here. So as you can see, there's a lot of code here. Maybe there is a better way with Laravel or some other frameworks, but this is the best I could come up with. So it's just going to get the connection, create a new connection again, and then get the user. And once I click the delete user button, it's going to make another request, for which I have a post handling mechanism here, and it is going to delete that user and redirect the user back to the home page. So you can also pass a server action defined in a server component to a client component as a prop. I'm just going to show you how to do that. So I'll call my server action as update user. Act as a server action. Notice that I have access to the parameters here. That is pretty cool. So I'm going to perform a SQL update here. So let's do a query. Now I can pass this function to a client component called delete age. And that delete age is going to take the update user as a prop, and it can attach it to the onClick handler. Now you cannot directly attach it as an onClick handler. So I'm going to pass in callback here. I'm going to call this. Now let's import this and render this in delete user. In the page, user page. So I can pass this as a prop. So after the update, we want to have the page revalidated. So I'm just going to call revalidate. So, but first I would like to check if the operation was successful. I hope it's effective, bros. Let's see. Revalidate path. Also get rid of this params.id here. Let's check this out. There you go. So after the update was successful, I was able to revalidate this path and get back the new state of the user. Let's just inspect this in network tab and see what happens. So there is already an open issue in Next.js where all the CSS files are reloaded again. As you can see, there was an asynchronous request that happened when I clicked the delete button. And after the revalidation, after the revalidate path, the CSS modules, all the CSS files and the fonts got reloaded again, re-downloaded again. So this is an open issue which Next team is working on. I'll link that issue in the description. So I have the same delete age button in the PHP app, which is also a form action. I'm doing a lot of hacks here to get the ID of the user and pass it as a form action parameter. So I have an asset here that checks if the delete age form was submitted. If it was, then I'm updating the user. So this is the best way I was able to do it in PHP. And once the update is successful, I'm refreshing the page again. Maybe there is a better way that I'm not aware of. Do let me know in the comments. But it works with a full page reload with all my assets re-downloaded again. So the last operation that I want to do is add favorite topics to the user, which is going to cover the use optimistic updates mechanism in server actions. Let's try that out. So I'm going to create a client component called favorite topics, which is going to use optimistic updates from React, which is an experimental hook to optimistically interact with the server action. Let's do that. Just going to call this favorite topics. It's going to take the ID of the user and topics, an initial prop called topics, which is of type string array actually. Now I do have some markup here that I'm going to paste. So this is going to render a form which takes an action called add topics and a reference to the form called formRef. Let's go ahead and first define the reference here. It's going to be a useRef. Just of HTML form element. And I'm going to define an optimistic state using the experimental optimistic updates mechanism from React. Let's bring that in. So it is called experimental use optimistic. Now this hook is going to return me two things. One is the optimistic topics, and the other is a function that you can use to add the topics optimistically. So let's pass in some generics to type this a little bit. So it is going to take a topic parameter, which is of type string, and a message saying that it is still adding, which is going to be of type boolean. And this is going to be a list. And now I can pass in some default values here. Now I can use the prop that I've already defined here as a default value. So I'm going to map over the topic and I'm going to create this initial state here. So it is going to be topic, adding is going to be false by default. And second argument is going to be a reducer function that gives us back a state and the action. Action here is the topic. And that is going to return the previous state plus a new state with adding as true now. So this is actually T. There you go. Now we have a mechanism to get some optimistic topics, show it to the user before any asynchronous operation is happening. What am I doing here? I'm running over my optimistic topics here. If the topic is not adding, if the topic is successfully added, then I don't render these classes. Basically, while the topic is adding, I'm going to show it in a different color. And once the topic is added, it's going to default to a blue color. Let's define the action in the actions file that we have created. So I'm going to call this add topics. This is an async function. We're going to take the same ID of the user and the topics, which is of type string. So this is going to be a plain string in my SQL database. I'm going to get the query that I already have. There you go. So it's going to update the user, set the topics to the topics that the user enters. Once this operation is successful, I again want to revalidate the path from next cache. It's going to be users and ID. Now I can use this add topic server action inside my favorite topics. I'm going to define a function called add optimistic topics. This is a callback. And now this optimistic topics is going to first add the topic that the user enters into the optimistic topics state here. And after that, it is going to call the server action add topics. So I'll get the topics from the form data here. This is going to be an async function with data. And now I want to reset the form before any operation. So I'm going to do that by using the form ref that I've created, calling a reset on the form. So now I can add this topic first to my local state here. So it's going to take the topic. And after that, I can await my action. So it's going to take the ID, just going to stringify and pass my optimistic topics. Finally, I can attach this add optimistic topics function to my form action here. I'll just quickly render my favorite topics in my user page. It requires an ID of the user and the topics of the user, which is again going to be a string. Actually, it is a string in database, so I would like to parse it. There you go. Let's check this out. Failed to compile, you are importing a component that needs useref. Okay, so I haven't marked my favorite topics as client component. Let's go ahead and do that. So this is going to be client component. Let's check this out. So I can add topics here, and after successfully adding the topic, next is doing a revalidate of this path. So we get back the new state of the user again. So you can notice that while I'm submitting this form, the color of the topic changes. So it optimistically gives a message to the user that something is happening. Once that is successfully done, whole revalidation brings back to the original state. So that was the last approach in Next.js with server actions. And I'm not going to bother too much about implementing the same in PHP. Maybe you do that and let me know if you can do it in the comments. So finally, I want to say that according to me, comparing PHP with server actions is not fair. I feel that server actions is a whole new approach in Next.js that ties well with the React server and client architecture. So finally, as always, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and do let me know your thoughts in the comments about server actions in Next.js. I'm going to be attaching the links to the GitHub repository in the description right below.